Hey guys, this is Ken from Vertibox, and you're watching another episode of the Marvel Heroes Leveling Guide. On this episode, we're going to take a look at Scarlet Witch, the mutant that caused M-Day. Now before we get in the guide, I want to make it very clear that all the footage you're about to see here is from the last day of the closed beta. Since the release of the game today, there hasn't really been a lot of changes done to Scarlet Witch. Gazillion did make a change to one of her skills, and we'll talk about that when we get into it. Scarlet Witch is actually one of the starter heroes, so for those of you who are looking to play the game for free, she's a pretty good choice for clearing out trash very quickly. She's an excellent ranged AoE character. One of Scarlet Witch's main weaknesses though is dealing high amounts of damage to single targets and bosses. It's not that her damage numbers aren't very good, it's just that she's very weak and can't stay in the same spot while doing damage. If you'd like to play a character that's going to do very well against bosses and single targets, then Hawkeye's probably going to be a much better choice for you. However, he has very weak AoE damage, so it's a bit of a trade-off. Ultimately, none of the starter heroes are very good at everything, so if you want a character that has a lot more versatility, you'll probably have to either fork over the cash or get lucky with the token system. And with that, let's get into the skill trees. The first skill tree is called Decimation, and it deals with Scarlet Witch's ability to deal damage. There's a lot of interesting skills here, but the ones you'll concern yourself most with are her basic attacks. The basic attack you start off with is called Hex Bolt, but there's really not a whole lot to say about it. It's simply outclassed by all of its upgrades. It's worth putting points into because it will speed up your leveling process, and it also applies a small synergy bonus to your other basic attacks, which is very useful because you'll be relying on those a lot throughout the game. Menacing Hex is simply much better, and this will be the basic attack that you use as soon as you unlock it. It has higher damage, it has a higher rate of fire, and on top of this, it also applies a defense debuff and the same type of damage that Scarlet Witch's attacks do. The really good feature with this debuff is that it lasts for 4.5 seconds, which gives you an opportunity to stack them. It also gives you an opportunity to cast other skills with the debuff on, so that way your other skills can do more damage. Now, the damage for these basic attacks is actually pretty solid, especially for a ranged character. My only real complaint with these basic attacks is that her projectile speed is extremely slow. Scarlet Witch is not one of those characters that can stand right next to a boss and take a lot of damage. She's very squishy. This means that you'll be using these basic attacks from a distance, and not all of them are going to connect with the boss. Bosses just don't stand there and take damage, they move around the battlefield, and this is probably one of my biggest complaints with Scarlet Witch at the moment. Things do get a lot easier in a group, so if you're fortunate enough to group with other players, then you're probably going to enjoy Scarlet Witch as a starter hero, but she's definitely not someone I recommend if you want to play by yourself. Ultimately, Menacing Hex offers the best single target damage that you have access to, so I'd recommend maxing this as well. The next skill is called Hex Orb, and it's part damage skill and part utility skill. The utility skill is actually pretty useful because it will stun mobs for about 2 seconds when it's fully maxed at level 15. However, the damage is a little bit lackluster. There is a little bit of an explosive radius to it, which allows you to hit multiple enemies, but I rarely found that ever being the case. Menacing Hex also does a lot more damage than this skill, and for 16 Spirit, I think Gazillion's asking too much for what it does. It's up to you whether you want to invest in this skill or not, as you will have 11 skill points by level 15 to decide what you want to do. Ultimately, I just wanted to cast Menacing Hex because it did more damage and applied the defensive debuff. Next up is Combustion Hex, and man, this skill used to be so overpowered. This was the skill that originally drew me into playing Scarlet Witch in the first place. With this skill, you'll plop a ring of fire on the ground, and any enemy caught within the ring will take damage over time for a period of 5 seconds. When this skill was doing 150 damage per tick, it was possible to kill waves of enemies very efficiently. During the last day of the beta, Combustion Hex was still pretty mediocre. However, now that the game's launched, Gazillion has improved the damage numbers somewhat, so it may be worth taking. As a point of comparison, there's a skill called Hex Binding, which not only holds enemies in place, but it does 3.7 times more damage per second than Combustion Hex. Since these skills cost about the same amount of spirit, Gazillion would have to really improve the damage numbers on Combustion Hex to make it worthwhile. Of course, if you're lucky enough to find one of those artifacts that give you infinite spirit regeneration, then picking this skill is a no-brainer. Being able to cast 2 damage over time skills over an area would allow you to absolutely wreck everything. Since I'm not an ultimate pack owner, I can't verify what the numbers are, unfortunately. However, if they're anywhere close to 150 damage per second at level 15, then I would absolutely recommend taking this skill. If they're still pretty low like you see on the screen here, then I would not recommend taking this skill. It's basically your judgment call because you'll have 11 points left over after these skill recommendations. The next skill tree is called Negation, and it basically deals with negating things such as the damage that's been dealt to you or negating enemies' defense. Enfeebling Veil is this sort of passive skill which reduces the amount of damage that enemies do to you. I kind of like this skill a little bit because you don't have to pay anything to get it, it's just something you turn on and you forget about it and you just take less damage. My only real complaint with this ability is that while it's awesome against trash mobs, it's not very good against bosses, and that's Scarlet Witch's main weakness. The damage being reduced is also fixed, so I can't see this being very good during the endgame either. My best recommendation to you is to try to shop for an item which gives you access to this skill at a high rank, that way you don't have to waste any skill points on it. The next skill is Withering Hex, which basically does the same thing as Enfeebling Veil but allows you to cast it anywhere on the map with a fairly large radius. If you actually like Enfeebling Veil, then putting a point here couldn't hurt. I wouldn't recommend placing any more points in here though, because it only seems to improve the duration. Unfortunately, this skill has all the same problems as Enfeebling Veil. It's not very good against bosses, and it doesn't scale very well with the endgame. Now, Enervating Hex looks like a fantastic skill for team-based play. What it does is reduce enemies' defense based on a percentage rather than a fixed amount. The reason why I say this skill is great for team-based play is that it doesn't reduce mental resistance, so it does nothing for your attacks. If you're one of those people that can consistently group with characters like Hulk or Captain America, then you're just gonna love this skill. If that's the case, then I'd recommend maxing it, but even if it's not, putting 1 point in here for a 22% damage reduction makes all the sense in the world. Lastly, we have the Disruption tree, which allows Scarlet Witch to inflict negative status effects on her enemies. Chaos Magic is a crazy skill because it gives you a chance of applying all sorts of negative status effects with every power in your arsenal. The first skill point is mandatory, and that's where you're going to get the most benefit from this skill. However, if Combustion Hex isn't worth spending your points on, then maxing this is certainly a valid option. Chthonic Gloom is a fear-inducing hex, but honestly I can't really recommend using this skill. While leveling, you want to be as efficient as possible, and if enemies are just running away from you, then you're going to spend way too much time chasing them down. The next skill is called Hex Binding, and this is honestly Scarlet Witch's best ability. It offers great AoE damage, and it even holds enemies into place. At level 15, you're going to be doing 300 damage to every enemy caught within the bind per second, which is double the amount of damage that your basic attack would do. And since you're going to be casting Menacing Hex in between your binds, you're going to be doing even more damage than that because of the debuff. The only real drawback to this skill is that it's not very good against bosses. The immobilization effect just doesn't really work that often against them. Even so, I'd highly recommend maxing this skill because this is what's going to enable you to power through the content. The last skill in the tree is Winds of Chaos, and this is Scarlet Witch's flight skill. I'd highly recommend placing 1 point in here because you're probably not going to survive against bosses without it. Now, if Scarlet Witch had her way, she would ask Gazillion to give this ability at level 12. That way she would have it during the Kingpin fight. Unfortunately, you'll get it at level 14, which means that you'll have to grind a little bit if you're going to take that on by yourself. And with that, this guide unfortunately has to come to an end. Hopefully this video guide has given you a lot of great information on how to level Scarlet Witch. Although while Scarlet Witch is not the most balanced character, she's actually a lot of fun to play. Just wrecking through trash mobs is actually a ton of fun. My only real wish to Gazillion is that they give Scarlet Witch the ability to deal with bosses by herself, because casting basic attacks with super slow projectiles just isn't any fun, and relying on a group all the time isn't really fun to some people either. So what do you guys think of Scarlet Witch? Do you like her ranged AoE abilities? Do you like the curses and the damaged over time concept? Do you think she's balanced or underpowered? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And if you like this video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe. Really appreciate it. Thanks for watching.